She screamed before the sirens did, pointing at me like I was a crime in progress, and in that instant I knew my quiet evening was about to collide with a law she thought she understood. I was standing on the sidewalk outside my own office building, waiting for a rideshare, scrolling messages, doing nothing more suspicious than checking the time. When she shouted that she had already called the police, people nearby slowed, phones lifted, curiosity sharpening like knives. She kept repeating words she half remembered, citing statutes, muttering phrases about loitering, obstruction, public safety, authority. I didn't interrupt, because sometimes the truth lands harder when it waits. 2 officers arrived fast, lights washing the building in red and blue, and she launched into her explanation with confidence. She quoted a subsection incorrectly, mispronounced the year, and demanded enforcement, staring at me like victory was inevitable. I finally spoke, calmly, asking if I could clarify something for the officers, and her eyes rolled. I explained that the language she cited was amended after a court challenge, that the clause she leaned on had been struck, and that the current standard required intent she couldn't show. The officers glanced at each other, then at me, curiosity replacing suspicion. I took a breath and told them why I knew the language so well, why the margin notes in their handbook matched my handwriting, and why the statute number on her lips had once lived on my desk. Her certainty cracked, and the night went very quiet. That was the moment everything changed. The officers asked for identification, not mine first, but hers, and the shift in power was visible, almost audible, like air leaving a balloon. She protested, insisting rules were rules, laws were laws, and ignorance was no excuse, repeating slogans without realizing they were about to apply to her. I stood there, patient, remembering the committee rooms, the late nights, the compromises, the commas argued over, the intent behind every word. One officer asked me, quietly, if I was who he thought I was, and I nodded. Her face drained as recognition dawned, not of me, but of her mistake. And as the situation turned, I realized this wasn't just about a misunderstanding, but about power, knowledge, and the danger of quoting rules without understanding them. Before anyone walked away, there was something important left to explain. It would define what happened next, how the officers responded, and why her call would echo far beyond that sidewalk. The law she quoted wasn't a weapon, and the lesson she was about to learn had consequences. Those consequences began right then. And this was only the beginning. Stay with me. Because the truth was just unfolding. Next, everything escalated. Fast. Suddenly. The officer who recognized me cleared his throat, not loudly, but enough to reset the temperature of the scene. He asked the other officer to step aside with him, leaving the woman standing there, arms crossed tighter now, confidence replaced by irritation. She kept talking anyway, trying to regain control, insisting she knew her rights, insisting she had the statute right here, waving her phone as if the screen itself granted authority. I stayed quiet, because this part mattered. When law enforcement pauses to confer, the story usually changes. I watched their expressions shift from routine procedure to careful attention, the kind you see when something unexpected enters the frame. The younger officer nodded, glanced at me again, then back at her. They returned together, measured, professional, and asked her a simple question: why exactly she believed a crime had occurred. She repeated herself, this time louder, adding assumptions she hadn't said before, describing how I looked like I didn't belong, how my presence made her uncomfortable, how the law gave her the right to call it in. The officer listened, then asked whether I had approached her, spoken to her, followed her, or interfered with her movement. She hesitated. Well, no, she said, annoyed by the direction of the questions. The officer nodded and explained, patiently, that discomfort was not a legal standard, and suspicion without articulable facts didn't meet the threshold she was citing. Her jaw tightened. She snapped back that she knew what the law said, that she had read it herself. That was when the officer asked if she knew it before or after the amendment. Silence. I stepped in gently, explaining the context, how the original wording had been challenged because it allowed enforcement based on subjective fear. I didn't say my role yet, just the history. Her eyes flicked to me, sharp, defensive, as if I'd crossed a line by knowing too much. The officer thanked me and added that misuse of emergency services was also governed by statute, one that required callers to act in good faith. Her posture shifted again, shoulders stiff, weight rocking back on her heels. She demanded to know why they were lecturing her instead of questioning me. The officer answered plainly, because nothing I was doing violated the law, but her call might. That word might hung there, heavy. She laughed nervously, saying that was ridiculous, that people called the police all the time. The officer agreed, then explained the difference between reporting a real concern and weaponizing the law. I finally introduced myself fully, stating my name and former role, watching the realization ripple through her face. Recognition didn't come instantly, but when it did, it was unmistakable. Her mouth opened, then closed, like she'd lost her place in a script she thought she controlled. The officer confirmed it quietly. The law she quoted hadn't just been amended. It had been rewritten by me. And now she had to face what that meant. The night wasn't over. Not even close. Her voice softened instantly, not with understanding, but with recalculation. People like her don't apologize first, they adjust strategy. She smiled, thin and forced, and said she hadn't meant any harm, that she was just being cautious, that in today's world you can never be too careful. The words sounded rehearsed, like lines she'd used before with better results. The officers didn't react. They simply asked her to stay where she was while they finished documenting the call. That's when the fear finally crept in. She glanced around, noticing the small crowd that had formed, the phone still raised, the attention she'd invited now turning against her. She tried to laugh it off, saying everyone was being dramatic, that it was no big deal. The senior officer disagreed, explaining that false or reckless reporting could carry consequences, especially when tied to discriminatory assumptions. She bristled at that word, immediately denying it, insisting she treated everyone the same. I didn't respond. I had learned long ago that defensiveness often reveals more than confession. The officer asked her again to explain, in her own words, what specific behavior had triggered the call. She struggled, repeating vague phrases, circling back to feelings instead of facts. Each time, the officer gently redirected her to actions, dates, observable conduct. Each time, she failed to provide them. The conversation slowed, deliberately, like a tightening net. I watched her confidence drain with every unanswered question. She finally snapped, pointing at me and demanding to know why my credentials mattered so much. That was when the officer explained something she hadn't considered: the law was designed to protect the public from exactly this kind of misuse. He told her that intent mattered, impact mattered, and that calling the police carried responsibility, not just privilege. I added quietly that the amendment she misquoted existed because people had been harmed by assumptions masquerading as safety concerns. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. She stared at me, eyes wide now, realizing this wasn't a debate she could win. The officer asked if she wished to amend her statement or withdraw her complaint. She hesitated too long. That hesitation was noted. He explained that they would file the report as unfounded, including her statements, and that further review could follow. Her breathing quickened. She asked if she was being arrested. The officer said no, not tonight, but warned her that future calls like this could lead there. Relief and humiliation crossed her face at the same time. She muttered something about misunderstanding and took a step back. The officers wrapped up, thanked me for my cooperation, and prepared to leave. As they did, one asked if I wanted to add anything to the record. I did. What I said next would ensure this moment didn't end on that sidewalk. It would follow her. And it would matter. I told the officer I wanted one sentence added to the report, nothing dramatic, just accurate. I asked him to note that the caller had explicitly cited a statute that did not apply, and that she had been informed of its correct interpretation on scene. He nodded and typed slowly, deliberately, reading it back to me for confirmation. Each word landed like a quiet gavel. The woman watched, arms hanging now instead of crossed, realizing the record would not reflect her version of events. She interrupted once, saying she didn't mean it like that, but the officer reminded her that reports capture what was said, not what was later wished. When he finished, he asked her to confirm her information. She hesitated before spelling her name, as if that alone might bind her to consequences. I thanked the officers and stepped aside, thinking the night might finally be done. It wasn't. As the patrol car pulled away, she turned on me, anger returning now that authority had left. She accused me of humiliating her, of abusing my knowledge, of making things bigger than they needed to be. I listened, because listening costs nothing. When she finished, I told her calmly that the law isn't a costume you put on to feel powerful. It's a tool meant to be used carefully, because real people stand on the other side of it. She scoffed, saying people like me didn't understand fear. That was when I explained, quietly, that fear was exactly why the amendment existed. I told her about the testimony, the families who had spoken, the nights spent rewriting language so fear wouldn't become probable cause. She tried to interrupt, but I continued, not unkindly, explaining that calling the police is not neutral, that it carries weight long after sirens fade. Her anger faltered, replaced by something closer to shame. She looked away, mumbling that she was just trying to be safe. I told her safety built on assumptions isn't safety at all. It's risk disguised as righteousness. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said she hoped I felt good about myself. I answered honestly, I felt tired. Tired of seeing words twisted, tired of watching laws used as shortcuts to power. I picked up my phone as my ride arrived, and as I opened the door, I added one last thing. I told her that tonight could end as a warning, or it could become a pattern, and only she decided which. I got in the car and left her standing there, smaller than when I'd first seen her, not because I had won, but because the illusion she relied on had cracked. As we drove away, I thought about how often this story repeats, and how rarely people see the consequences unfold. But in this case, they would. Because reports don't disappear. And neither do lessons. What happened next would prove that. I didn't think about her again until 3 days later, when an email landed in my inbox with a subject line that made me sigh before I even opened it. A request for clarification. Internal review. Reference number attached. That single report from the sidewalk had already moved. When someone cites law incorrectly, when officers flag a call as unfounded, the system does what it's designed to do, it checks itself. I forwarded the email to a colleague and went back to work, but the memory lingered. That night, I was asked to give a brief statement, not because I was in trouble, but because the statute had my name on it. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In the conference room, familiar faces listened as I explained exactly what happened, step by step, tone neutral, facts clean. No embellishment. No emotion. Just sequence and substance. They thanked me and said the caller would be contacted for follow-up. I nodded, knowing what that usually meant. When people realize their actions triggered a paper trail, reality sets in fast. 2 days later, she reached out herself. Not directly to me, but through a mediator, asking for a conversation to clear the air. I declined. Some lessons don't need discussion. Instead, I received the summary of the follow-up interview. She had doubled down at first, insisting she was misunderstood, that officers had taken sides. But when presented with the recording, the report, and the statute's actual language, her story unraveled. Inconsistencies stacked. Motivations were questioned. Intent came into focus. The review concluded that her call met the threshold for reckless reporting. No charges were filed, but a formal warning was issued, documented, permanent. She was required to complete a brief course on appropriate use of emergency services. It was the lightest consequence available, and still, she fought it. Appeals failed. Facts are stubborn that way. When the process ended, I felt no satisfaction. Just confirmation. This is how systems are supposed to work when people are held to the same standard they try to impose on others. Weeks passed. The incident faded from conversation, but not from record. Then I saw a post online, vague but familiar, someone complaining about being silenced for speaking up, blaming experts, blaming the system. I recognized the language. I closed the page. Accountability often feels like oppression to those who've never faced it. The real impact wasn't on her, though. It was on the officers, the bystanders, the quiet correction that happened without headlines. That's how change actually sticks. Not with viral moments, but with follow-through. And just when I thought the story had ended, something unexpected happened. A call came in. Different name. Same statute. And this time, the outcome would be very different. The call came on a rainy afternoon, routine on its face, but familiar in its bones. A citizen reported a suspicious man outside a municipal building, quoting the same statute, the same broken logic, the same confidence. I listened from the review desk as the dispatcher relayed details, and I felt the echo before the sound. This time, the responding officers were trainees. That mattered. I asked to observe. Not intervene, not correct, just watch. When they arrived, the man stood calmly under an awning, reading on his phone. No threats. No obstruction. The caller hovered nearby, narrating assumptions. The trainees followed protocol, asking clear questions, separating feelings from facts. They did it by the book. My book. When the caller cited the law, one trainee paused, then asked for specific behavior that met the elements. The caller faltered. The trainee explained the amendment, cleanly, respectfully, without naming me. It was better that way. Authority didn't come from a title, it came from understanding. The caller grew agitated, insisting experience trumped technicalities. The trainee disagreed, gently, saying rights weren't technicalities, and misuse had consequences. I watched the moment land. The call resolved as unfounded. A warning issued. No spectacle. No speeches. Just process. Afterward, the trainees debriefed. They asked why the statute existed, why language mattered, why assumptions were dangerous. I answered. I told them about power drifting when words are vague, about fear filling gaps law should close. I told them that the hardest part of writing rules is imagining how they'll be misused, not how they'll be praised. One trainee said something that stuck with me, that clarity felt like kindness. He was right. Clear law protects everyone, including those tempted to wield it poorly. As I left, rain thinning, I realized the sidewalk incident had become a lesson, then a practice, then a habit. That's how change spreads. Not by shaming one caller, but by equipping many officers. Still, stories don't end when lessons begin. They circle back. That night, my phone buzzed with a message I didn't expect, from a number I hadn't saved. It was her. The woman from the sidewalk. The text was short. No accusations. No excuses. Just a question that surprised me. It asked whether I would explain the law to her, not to win, but to understand. I stared at the screen, weighing time against purpose. The answer would shape what came next. I decided to reply the next morning, proposing a public workshop, neutral ground, open chairs, questions welcomed, ego checked. If learning was genuine, transparency would help. If it wasn't, sunlight would reveal that too. Either way, the statute would speak plainly, and everyone would hear it. That choice felt fair, necessary, grounded in principle, responsibility, patience, and care. The workshop was scheduled for a Thursday evening in a modest community hall, the kind with folding chairs, buzzing lights, and a whiteboard scarred by years of use. I arrived early, unsure how many people would actually come. When the doors opened, they kept coming. Neighbors, students, city employees, a few officers in plain clothes, and yes, the woman from the sidewalk, sitting in the second row, hands folded, eyes forward. No one pointed. No one whispered. That mattered. I began without introductions, writing the statute number on the board and asking a simple question: what do you think this law is for? Hands went up immediately. Answers came fast, confident, and mostly wrong. I let them speak. I always do. Then I erased the board and rewrote the same number, this time breaking it into elements, explaining intent, thresholds, safeguards. Faces changed as understanding replaced assumption. I explained why vague fear couldn't be enough, how history had taught us that discomfort often targets the wrong people, and how emergency systems collapse when used as personal enforcement tools. The room grew quiet, attentive. The woman listened without interrupting. When questions opened, she raised her hand last. She didn't defend herself. She didn't justify the call. She asked why the law felt different when explained this way. I answered honestly, because laws are written for the worst moments, not the most convenient ones. Because power needs limits more than good intentions need validation. She nodded slowly. Others asked about consequences, about officer discretion, about accountability. I explained that fairness lives in process, not personalities. When the workshop ended, people lingered, talking, comparing notes, realizing how close they'd come to making the same mistake. As chairs folded and lights dimmed, the woman approached me. She thanked me, simply, and said she hadn't realized how easily fear could sound like certainty. I told her that realization was the point. We shook hands. No forgiveness speeches. No redemption arc. Just understanding earned the hard way. Days later, feedback came in. The city requested more sessions. Officers asked to bring the workshop into training. The statute stopped being a quote and became a lesson. That's how laws survive misuse, they're taught, not brandished. Looking back, the sidewalk incident wasn't an ending or a victory. It was a hinge, a small moment where misunderstanding met clarity. And clarity won quietly. Not with sirens, but with seats filled and questions asked. The law did what it was meant to do. It protected someone standing still, and it taught someone to pause before calling for power she didn't fully grasp. Stories like this don't go viral the way outrage does, but they last longer. Because they change behavior. And just when I thought the lesson had settled into routine, something happened that tested it in a way I didn't expect. A case reached my desk that would put every word to the test. The case file was thicker than usual, the kind that arrives with quiet urgency instead of noise. A detention. A complaint. Body camera footage flagged for review. The same statute again, but this time, the stakes were higher. A man had been stopped, questioned, briefly detained, all based on a call nearly identical to the one from that sidewalk weeks earlier. The difference was outcome. This time, the responding officer had misapplied the law. Not maliciously. Not recklessly. Just imperfectly. And imperfection matters when authority is involved. I watched the footage carefully, noting where uncertainty crept in, where the officer relied on the caller's confidence instead of the statute's elements. The caller sounded sure. The words were familiar. The mistake was subtle, and that's what made it dangerous. In review, I explained how the threshold hadn't been met, how the detention extended beyond what the law allowed. The room was tense. No one likes pointing out errors, especially when intentions were good. I reminded them that accountability isn't punishment, it's maintenance. Systems fail when corrections feel personal. The officer listened, took notes, asked questions. That mattered more than the mistake itself. The detention was ruled improper. The department issued a corrective memo, updated training language, and notified the individual involved. An apology was offered. It was accepted. Quietly. No lawsuit. No headlines. Just correction. Later that week, I thought about the woman again, about how easily confidence spreads from caller to officer when law sounds like certainty. I thought about the workshop, the trainees, the folding chairs. This was the test. Not whether the law could stop misuse, but whether it could repair it. That night, I revised the training materials myself, adding examples, clearer decision trees, stronger language around caller bias. I didn't sign my name. The work didn't need it. When the update rolled out, feedback came fast. Officers said it helped. Dispatchers said it helped. Fewer stops escalated. Fewer calls lingered. Clarity did its quiet work. Weeks later, I ran into the officer from the case in the hallway. He thanked me, not for pointing out the error, but for explaining it without judgment. He said it made him better. That's the goal. Laws aren't monuments. They're tools that need sharpening. As I walked out that evening, I passed the same sidewalk where it all began. No crowd. No sirens. Just people moving through their lives, unnoticed, unbothered. That's success in this line of work. Not recognition, but absence of harm. The statute she quoted, the one with my handwriting in the margins, had done its job again. Not by winning an argument, but by correcting a course. There was one final thing left to say, one truth that tied it all together, and it deserved its own ending. I stood on that sidewalk one last time, not because I needed closure, but because places remember even when people move on. The building looked the same, the street sounded the same, yet the meaning had shifted. What began as an accusation had become a mirror, reflecting how easily power slips into the hands of those who quote rules without understanding them. I thought about the woman, the officers, the trainees, the workshop, the case file. None of it was extraordinary on its own. That was the point. The most dangerous moments aren't dramatic, they're ordinary, wrapped in confidence and routine. The law exists for those moments, not to elevate one person over another, but to slow everyone down. I've learned that writing a statute is the easy part. Living with it is harder. Once words leave the page, they meet fear, bias, haste, and pride. They get bent, tested, sometimes broken. The measure of good law isn't whether it's quoted loudly, but whether it holds steady under pressure. That night, she thought the law was a shield she could raise against discomfort. She didn't realize it was also a boundary, one that applied to her as much as to anyone else. I don't tell this story to embarrass her. I tell it because she's not unique. Many people believe knowledge is the same as understanding, that reading a line gives them authority over others. It doesn't. Understanding requires humility, context, and restraint. The officers who paused, the trainee who asked better questions, the caller who eventually listened, they all proved something important. Systems improve when people are willing to learn. Even mistakes can become tools, if they're handled with care. As I left the sidewalk, I thought about the future, about laws not yet written, about the next person who might quote words they barely grasp. I hope an officer asks the right question. I hope a dispatcher hesitates. I hope someone remembers that discomfort is not evidence. The law I wrote wasn't meant to silence fear, it was meant to prevent fear from becoming force. That distinction matters more now than ever. Power doesn't always announce itself with sirens. Sometimes it whispers through a phone call, a citation, a confident tone. And responsibility lives in how we answer that whisper. The lesson here isn't that I wrote the law. It's that the law worked, not perfectly, but purposefully, because people chose to use it the right way. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this: before you reach for authority, learn its limits. Before you quote a rule, understand its intent. And before you call for power, ask yourself who might be harmed if you're wrong. That pause can change everything. It did that night. And it will again.